Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Happy 2022. This is the first session of this series, TIBCO Labs for Developers of the year. It is very exciting. I'm very excited to have a very special guest today to kick us off on the right gear for the year here. As usual, welcome everybody. I see people signing up from all parts of the world, which is very exciting as always. People from Sweden, Germany, France, Morocco, here in the States from California, Florida, and many other places. So welcome everybody. Thanks for your time today. So today we're joined here by Gloria Kimwallan. She's responsible for customer success at Gitcoin, and also Nelson Petracek, CTO at TIBCO. So we have an interesting topic to get us started here, the future of open web. So I thought, Nelson, Gloria, just to get us started, maybe level set with everybody here. And I know, you'll probably come at from different angles to this question, but just overall description of what we mean by open web. It's a term that we hear in many different type of, context or conversations, right? And sometimes people may mean something different, right, when they use the term open web. So maybe we start there. Ladies first, Gloria. Yeah, welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and to be talking about, open web, Web3, blockchain technology. It goes by a lot of different names, but I'm excited to be talking with you all. When we talk about open web, so Web 2 is our traditional internet that we've had, Facebook, all of those different platforms, Gmail, all on. Traditionally within a Web 2 space, your privacy, your data, all is in the servers of whoever you're dealing with, and then trying to access it is like really somewhat difficult. In a Web3 space with blockchain, all of the data is all kind of shared, it lives on the chain. And so there's a lot of different components such as like immutability, privacy, those type of characteristics that are built into a Web3 space. And so it's very much more decentralized, and it's not so centralized into one like company's server. That's usually like the overview of how I can start to describe it. It's much more, technical than that, but the more key components is like it's decentralized versus centralized.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with that. There's so many different angles and ways in which you could describe this. The conversations that we typically have with customers and just other folks that are obviously heavily involved in this space. If a person looks at it, there's a large element of community, I think, that is really associated with Web3. And as Gloria mentioned, there's this idea of ownership and who has rights to your data and who monetizes that information. And we're starting to see sort of the development of communities around that, and this push towards putting ownership back in the hands of the individual. And whether that is now the data that you're providing today, probably freely, and you're not making any money off of it in many cases. Other organizations are, but you aren't necessarily under control of that. Or whether it's things like your identity. So how do you maintain control over your identity and make sure that it's you managing it and deciding who has access to certain elements or attributes of your identity? There's this just element of just community around the internet. Now, with Web3, you find that there are some versions of it out there that just say, well, we're just going to replace the internet as it stands today. I don't go that far. I don't think we're going to replace the internet as it stands today in a overnight kind of thing. But I think there are elements of Web3, whether it's from a conceptual standpoint or obviously from a technology standpoint, it can be used to enrich and augment what we have today. So I usually am describing it or talking about it in that context. As you mentioned, there's many different contexts in which you can put this.
So and you bring a good point, right? Because there's different layers to this onion, let's call it, right? Like, so there's the design aspect, there's the technology aspect, right? And there's different standards in both, right? So maybe we start like a little bit on the I guess the technology side, right? Like, I mean, just describing, Gloria, for example, you mentioned blockchain, right, as one of the technologies or terms, right, that will come up in the conversation, right? But like overall, what are the most sort of like hottest technologies when it comes to open web that you see out there? I know, Gloria, and I didn't describe your role, right? But like I know you have a very long experience, right, interacting with different type of developer communities, right, and helping these developer communities build up their skill sets. So from that angle, I mean, what are some of the hottest technologies related to open web?
I think that the thing that's been really interesting for me within open web is like there are the different blockchain technologies that you have, whether you're building on like an Ethereum or you're building on like Arweave or whatever your specific chain is. But the other side of it is like the structure of like how you can do businesses is totally different. The way that we do art, the instructions of tokens, it's just this whole completely different shift. And so what tends to be important within the Web3 spaces is like kind of like a couple of different things. One of them is the organizations themselves are so much more decentralized. They have what are called DAOs, distributed autonomous organizations, instead of like a corporate structure, so that people are working more towards like a goal or a mission versus like a hierarchical type things. As far as developers are concerned, we always still need developers and designers and things of that nature, but it tends to be like kind of like the old school way of developing, where like you kind of have to solve a problem and really dig deep into it, and then like share the knowledge a little bit more. Where within the Web2 space, you might be able to really look into documentation real well, or ask a friend who also had been exposed to this. This is a very early technology, so when you find an issue, you might be the person who found the issue and the one who actually solves it too. So a lot of the skills where the developers are succeeding are the traditional problem solving skills of being able to like really find a problem, articulate the problem, knowledge share that problem out, and then trying something new. So like, oh, well, if I know how to do this, if I know how to, I'm trying to think of something. Set up a game in the Web2 space. Can I set up that same game in the Web3 space, even if it's a simple game? And what are the challenges that I'm facing, and how can I provide that feedback back into the organization? Those are some of the early skills that we've seen like people being the best at. The other side of it that's really interesting is like the security side of things too, where security is something where the approach maybe hasn't really changed in a lot of times. Like a vulnerability is a vulnerability, and you can kind of exploit a vulnerability in the same way, whether it's a Web2 or Web3 space. But being able to know the right libraries, the right tools in the Web3 space is much more important. I mean, it's equally as important. It just might not have as many of the tools there. And so creating those tools, knowing the right libraries to use, knowing the right stuff to use has been really important there. So I've seen a lot of people dealing with transitioning where like they were in Web 2 and now they want to come into Web 3 and they think like they have to know Solidity real well, or they need to know, like the Truffle suite of tools real well. And ideally, you can learn those. It's more the overarching things like how would you connect, how do you connect to, what was an interesting problem we had? We had a problem the other day where it's like, should I use like IPFS to store some of the actual like assets that were being stored, or which is a more decentralized file system than, or do I do AWS, which is much more like centralized? And it's trying to figure out when you're plugging these pieces to build your system, like trying to use actual like open source or Web3 solutions versus our traditional Web2 ones.
That's a great point right there. So, which I guess triggers a question in my mind. I mean, we talk about like the different layers, right? So technology is definitely one of them, but how does this affect design and architecture of enterprise applications? And Nelson, I know that's an area that you're definitely involved in with multiple type of customers, right? So what are you seeing, in terms of when organizations come and try to start, kind of like the conversation from scratch, right? Like the main topics that they have to consider.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those things where it's very much, and you use the word layered. It is a layered, very much a building block, kind of composable style of approach where obviously an enterprise is not going to throw away all the technologies that they built out over n number of years. I mean, anything from mainframes to the newer and latest and greatest cloud-related technologies. So there's a couple different ways that you have to look at this. One is that as a business and as an organization, how and where do you see yourself fitting in and providing products and services in the Web3 space? So for example, obviously NFTs, tokenization are an aspect of Web3. So I've got these programmable digital tokens, if you will, that can represent something. They can represent digital art, which is what we typically all hear about, but it's much, much broader than that. It can represent different elements of an organization, what they're trying to convey or present or provide as a service to a customer. And you can make that, again, very programmable because that's all, again, being built on smart contracts and blockchain technology and so on and so forth. But you have to start with the notion of, okay, what is an NFT? How does it apply to me? And how can I leverage it in my business? And then from there, once I have an idea of what that NFT needs to represent and the capability you're trying to bring, what are the layers of technology I need to support that? Because Web3 can be very broad. There can be many different elements that you can bring to a Web3 technology stack. The word blockchain is kind of this all-encompassing term that can actually in itself mean, is it a layer 1 protocol? Is there a layer 2 protocol involved? Are you using smart contracts? What's the API layer? What kind of storage do you need, as Gloria mentioned? How are you going to build your dApps? Are you using a browser-based interface? Are you using wallets? Pretty soon that becomes quite a complicated set of technologies, if you will. So as an enterprise, you want to narrow it down. What is the value you can bring to Web3? And then what is the core technology stack you're going to need to support it? And how is that going to work with what you already have? Because it's not going to work standalone, right? Information about your customers comes from somewhere. It's not just automatically on the blockchain network itself. So it's this convergence of what it is that you're trying to do. Are you culturally and organizationally ready to try and do that in the Web3 space? You might have to spin off a separate team to deal with it. And then what do you need from a technology perspective to support it? And then how's that going to integrate with what you already have?
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So I think like there's definitely a relationship, right, between open web and open source projects, technologies, advancements, and whatnot, right? So, I realize that this could easily be like a chicken and egg type of thing, right? But which one is driving which, right? Like, I mean, is open source driving the open web or the other way around?
From what I see, at GetCoin, I have to deal a lot with, hackathon projects. And so having open source projects is always our start. And it really drives open web. And I think one of it is like conceptually, as people try to realize like, oh, the open source community is there, they have different tools available for people. It really drove, some of the problems that we have in the open web or solutions that we're trying to find. Because traditionally within open source, when people were working on open source projects, it might be like a hobby or they had like a work requirement, and their open source libraries were just tools that they had for fun, but maintaining those open source libraries or projects was not like their main source of income. And so with GetCoin, we're like, well, how can we take those people who are working on open source and like contribute to them, because they're creating public goods, they're creating public goods that we're all utilizing, and that kind of drives it to the Web3 space. And so when we're looking at tools, even from an internal perspective, we always say, well, is there a Web3 tool that we can use? Okay, now, well, let's see, is there a open source project that we can use? Because these people are both in open source and in open web creating public goods for people to utilize. And I think that's like one of the main discussions. It's like there are situations within the open source community where, there were hurdles that they we're coming up across, and could we in open web kind of utilize either, tokens or distributions or grants or quadratic funding or all these other mechanisms that are there in order to impact that space as well. So yeah, we are definitely open web is very friendly with open source communities. And I think that is the way to go. And it's the backbone of the Web3 space for sure.
Yeah, and that's we see that as well. I mean, Gitcoin's a great example of how you can bring together communities of typically open source developers for bounty programs and hackathons and some of these other elements that are important to evolving the technologies that will underpin Web3. And without that type of involvement, that engagement, that level of community, you'll quite frankly end up with where we are today. You'll have, and this is actually one of the arguments in the industry is Web3 really fully decentralized, or is it still held in the hands of a few centralized VCs? And you would have heard a lot about that on Twitter, and I'm not going to get into rightly or wrongly or whatnot, but is it just evolving into the same form as what we have today, where you've got power that is much more centralized, let's say, as opposed to being decentralized? And so the idea behind open source and the decentralized nature of it and the community-driven aspect of it, that culture has to be brought to bear in order to make Web3 successful and to meet many of the the goals, if you will, of what it is that area is trying to achieve. Again, the technology is one element of it, but if you have all the funding, let's say, coming from 3 organizations across the globe for all Web3 technologies, are we any different than what we have today? Probably not, would be the argument, right? So anyway, that's where I think the open source, the approach that's been used for years and years and years, can then drive how we progress with Web3.
Yeah. And I see a question coming in, which is fits perfectly into what you just said, Nelson. And just as a reminder for anybody else that has any questions, feel free to type them in, and we'll introduce them as they come. So the question is, what are some of the biggest risks of Web3? From Shelley.
I think I just mentioned one.
Yeah. Centralization is definitely I think traditionally, like a couple years ago, we'd be like, is this, what is centralization? And now, or what is decentralization? And then now it's like, is this really decentralized? And I think that's something that we're going to continue to be asking ourselves, because when you see it, even as an organizational structure, whether it's the times that people work or the languages where things are communicated or the funding, the access to the funding that people get, it does tend to be decentralized or centralized in a way. And so within Web3, I think you're going to start to continually see mechanisms that make decentralization a little bit easier and changing the systems that we traditionally use. So whether it is, VC funding, which is, always following or always seeking VC funding, which will be a threat to projects if they are decentralized and they're, touting that and then eventually go seek VC funding and then have those type of objectives. Or if they're going to, only have it accessible to certain languages and then not have it accessible to people more broadly with that type of centralization. So that's always the one threat that we constantly are looking at and trying to help people with our quadratic funding. It allows for them to be funded in a different totally mechanism other than VC funding. So it's trying to get, public goods funded by the people, and the more people that are funding it, then the more of the centralized pool that you get for it. So it makes the need for VC funding kind of further out, and you can fund your grants as you deliver your business a lot more efficiently without needing the needs of VC funding. So there is, mechanisms I think that are continually going to be changing within, like the whole space, from the impacts of Web3. Someone else asked, with Web3 and the way that it continues to grow, it's this whole concept of like bear market versus bull market might have to go, because it's not such a linear thing like stocks. It's much more of like pools and like ecosystems. So having it in one of a linear perspective might not work as much too. So there's a lot of impacts that Web3 is continually having. And since that space is evolving, we don't really see, don't know exactly what the impact is, because everything else is evolving around it as well.
Yeah, and just to add to that too, Jesus, I think the two other elements are related to everything that Gloria just said. Obviously, the technology risk. I mean, if you look at the architectural stack diagram for Web3 and you compare that to Web2, there's a difference. It's not a small difference. And so there's a technology element here as well that can lend itself to being there's risk associated with it. It's new and emerging, it's evolving. So what is that final stack going to look like, and how complex is it going to be to deal with?
Yeah.
And then the other element, I think, is regulatory and sort of that whole legal side of things. And Gloria and I were talking right before this live stream about her experiences with the legal side of some of the topics that we run into with Web3. And you're seeing that now in, let's say, the decentralized finance space and with tokens and different countries and what they're going to allow or not allow. And, what is this regulatory environment going to look like? Because it's going to lag. Obviously, the pace of innovation on the technology side is going to be way in front of the regulatory side of things. And so how do you align those two such that one isn't in conflict with the other? I think that is also going to be a set of challenges that will have to be overcome here in the next few years.
I have to agree with you, Nelson, when it comes to regulatory. And for me, it's like, I never was a huge fan of watching C-SPAN, but now as like a technology person trying to watch like legislators try to understand technology, it's just very comical to me sometimes. So yeah, it's interesting to watch the lag happen, but really to sit there and think like, man, these people are making these decisions and I don't know if they get it. But even beyond that, sometimes, with GetCoin, we deal with, quadratic voting and different types of processes now, or like even just DAO tools, and making decisions so much more easier and efficient. And I feel like the more people are exposed to some of these like consensus mechanisms and they see how efficient they are, they look back at traditional things, whether it's traditional voting, things like that, and they are wondering like how policies are being made and how inclusive are they, or things of that nature. So I think the impact is not just the technology, it's a lot of it spans a lot further on like how decisions are being made, how businesses are run, things of that nature. So the future of Web3 is not solely like, how's it going to impact technology? It's really going to be, how is it going to impact technology? How's it going to impact governance? How's it going to impact work as we know it?
You almost read my mind, Gloria, because I was going to ask you, just to close this section, what's in the road ahead of Open Web? I mean, what's sort of like the roadmap or the future that you see?
Yeah, for me, it's been a lot of, last year, if you said, what's the future, we'd say like, oh, DeFi, and then we have NFT booms. And so there's all of these things that kind of come up. So I could say something today and tomorrow something amazing will start to brew and then it will be like not even on our roadmap. But one of the things that I personally am always really interested is looking at the DAO tooling. So these whole like decentralized autonomous organizations is what a lot of the Web3 spaces are using to like run their businesses and letting people be the deciding drivers into like the way the businesses are going and the way the organizations are going, not really businesses, the way the organizations are going and the decisions that are being made there. And as these DAO tools create for more transparency and more efficiency, and less like people interaction to it, then I think that a lot of decisions are going to be made quicker, but it's really going to allow for a more innovation in the space too. And I'm excited to see that. So the tooling sections, or the tools and the impact of the tools on DAOs, is something where I'm really excited to see. And then from being in a DAO, I see the impact of people, the way people work is a lot differently. So there's just some people are much more, 5 hours a week. They're not working for one company. They're working for a couple different DAOs. I think that's going to change the landscape of like how remote workers work and being able to be more digitally nomad throughout the space. It might allow more people to have different hours and more freedoms. And I think more people are kind of demanding that side of it. Within the Web3 space, I feel like there's been a lot more like specialty people coming up on, especially like with security sites. Like if you're someone who does with a security aspect, You're able to kind of build what you love and contribute what you love back into the community. And I think that's resonates a lot with people who do open source, because they're building things because they want to see it in the world. And being able to be financially compensated for those tools is like extremely impactful too. So those are kind of the things that we see. I think the NFT space is fun. It's interesting. It's great. I'm not into it. My son asked for an NFT girlfriend and it freaked me out. So that type of thing is a little weird sometimes, but it's interesting. It's really interesting to see how cool the kids that are involved with it now too. So my son's 12. So theoretically, by the time he starts college or school, he would have been on Discords for 6 years, or understanding DAOs for 6 years, and holding crypto. This is ideally how he understands working, and seeing that impact in a generation is really interesting for me too. But I'm really passionate about seeing like more Web 2 developers as they start to come into a Web 3 space, their transitions that they have into it, and how that changes, how they work. And how it changes the space as it continues to grow too. So yeah, it's really been fascinating for me. It's been really interesting to see people from all over the world contribute to it, and seeing them themselves being their own employers now, just by being able to create Web 2 projects or create grants to supplement the projects and things like that, winning bounties. It's had an economic impact that I didn't foresee, like as far as at the start of it. But we're really able to see a lot of developers from all over kind of just work for themselves, and I'm really excited about that. I like seeing developers kind of have their quality of life be in their own terms, rather than having to have it any other way. Or if they want to work for a company, they can work for a company as well. So it's fascinating.
Yeah, no, great. Great answer. Yeah, thank you for that, Gloria.
And a good question too.
And I guess to close then the webinar today, Nelson, there's a question from the audience, just to get your take on this question. It says, question from Shelly, wondering if Web3 could be the downfall for things like credit scores and ratings.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I always find this questioning to be really fascinating, because especially before being at Getcoin, I was at Square. So I've had my life in finance and financial industries for a while. And the one things that I would have to say is that one thing that I would hope would not happen in Web 2 would be like the same type of people build the same type of things on Web 3 space. So like, if we're going to create all of these DeFi protocols and have all of these different new innovations there, then trying to bring a credit score to DeFi might not be like the best use of, transparency and decentralization. Even having like the social credits or things like that, that would be interesting too. I think that whenever you're building something, you have to still always think about like bias that comes in, that can come in. So if I'm going to build a solution, let's say for Ecuador, and I think like, I'm going to come from my lens and I'll build the best solution, that might not be best. Might be best is if I show the people in Ecuador the tools and let them develop a solution that's best for them, And I think that within the DeFi space, what we'll probably see might not be something like credit score per se. It might be some type of feedback mechanism for people to understand, like, is this person trustworthy or not? But that might differ from platform for platform, or people will sit there and say, or might question, like, why do we need this in general too? So I'm hoping that some of the biases that come into like traditional credit scores, such as, gender, race, whatever, social, economic factors, that those will be gone, but people will find new innovative ways to decide whether or not to lend people and to not. And I think that will differ from platform to platform, from protocol to protocol. And it might be like the length of time that you've held a token, or how much of a token that you have, or whatever it might be. And so that's fascinating to see, like, wow, how people decide to decide to say who's worthy and who's not. But what is exciting is, like, within these new financial structures that are happening within DeFi, it opens the door to people who traditionally had been excluded from financial systems to play around a little more, get involved in it a little bit more. Even understanding like earning crypto and playing video games versus like the traditional way of doing it. There's a lot more ways for people to earn. There's a lot more ways for people to understand like what is my rate of return on this investment, things of that nature. And so getting more people to participate from different places has been really interesting. And it just creates a more inclusive discussion around what is currency? What is currency in general? Why would a whole country want to adopt to a token? Why would we want a stable coin? Do we want a bank to have a stable coin? There's all of these different questions, which makes people really start thinking about financial structures. And I feel like the more those discussions happen to people and people start questioning a different system rather than the traditional system that we have, the better off we all are, because we have more knowledge and more power in general.
Yeah, I think definitely the programmability and accessibility are key elements here. Absolutely. I mean, it's and the ability to provide different types or new ways of business models. Completely agree with Gloria. We can't just rebuild the same thing in new tools. How are you going to end? There's a saying around that, right? If you keep doing the same thing over and over, how do you expect a different result? So there's that element of it that we have an opportunity with a lot of the ways in which the technology has evolved. We have the opportunity to provide some of these capabilities, including things like financial products and services, in a very, very different way. And so that we are much more inclusive, as opposed to being, it's only available to relatively speaking, a few, and then also to be innovative in terms of the products that are offered and how people can participate in whatever the new economy is. Gloria mentioned, play to earn, and we've got GameFi, so the combination of gaming and decentralized finance, and some of these concepts are kind of blending and merging together. And if I had known years ago, I could have made a bunch of money playing video games. I should have done that, but that would be the idea. I mean, there's a lot of new and innovative ways that people can participate in the new version of the economy, and it's more up to them, right? As Gloria mentioned, you can work for a company. I don't have to work for a company. I've got other options in terms of how I can get compensated for my contribution. So yeah, I think that's the opportunity. So we have the same kind of credit scoring system. Hopefully not, but there'll be some element of trust and some mechanisms there, because obviously there's still risk associated with these transactions, even in that sense. But the metrics and the measures and the programmability hopefully will allow us to be very different.
Excellent. Yeah, sounds like we'll have to have Gloria back again here. Like, I love the last question you asked. Do we need currency? Maybe we'll open with that question the next time that you are here. And but for now, thank you so much, Gloria, for your time. Nelson, thank you for your time as well. Great conversation as always. And just a quick commercial. We'll see you again on Wednesday, February 16. We'll have Jordan Schwetz from Twilio. And we'll talk about how to leverage open source technologies to enhance your customer engagement experience. Sorry. So we'll see everybody again on the 16th. And thanks again for being here.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Jesus. Thanks all.
Have a good day.
Bye, everybody.